trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Coming up tonight, is this the end for Diane Abbott? Why do our governments want to turn the entirety of the North Sea into one giant wind farm? Can the government win its court case over Rwanda? And much, much more. But before all of that, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening to you. The top story on GB News tonight. The government says it's taking the Royal College of Nursing to court after labelling their planned strike action as unlawful. The health Barclay says he's been left with no choice but to proceed with legal action following attempts by his officials to resolve the situation. It comes as the union prepares to take industrial action from the 30th of April to the 2nd of May. The RCN's leader Pat Cullen described the government's anti-trade union legislation as draconian. Well, the Confederation of British Industry says it has dismissed a number of people after a series of sexual misconduct and rape allegations. Dozens of the body's members, including BMW, Vodafone and John Lewis, have left, with the organisation suspending all its policy and membership activities. Earlier, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said there's no point engaging with the CBI anymore and that the government wants to work with a trade body that sticks up for business. Now, as you've been hearing, Sir Keir Starmer says the comments made by the Labour MP Diane Abbott were anti-Semitic. In an article for The Observer, the former Shadow Health Secretary said Jewish, Irish and traveller people experience prejudice but not racism. She's since withdrawn the remarks and apologised. Labour has previously come under fire for anti-Semitic remarks made by former party leader Jeremy Corbyn. Sir Keir said he was absolutely right to act as swiftly as he did.
What she wrote yesterday, I utterly condemn. And I said we would tear out anti-Semitism by its roots. I meant it, and that's why we acted so swiftly yesterday. I think it's a mark of how far the Labour Party has changed, that we acted so swiftly and that we take it so seriously. But I condemn what she said.
Sir Keir Starmer. Now, the Africa Minister Andrew Mitchell says the government's exploring every conceivable option to evacuate British nationals from Sudan in northeast Africa. Germany has already evacuated more than 300 people today. We believe British citizens were among them. An emergency COBRA meeting has been held today with the Foreign Office advising those still in the country to stay indoors and await further instructions amid a violent conflict between the Sudanese army and a powerful paramilitary group. There are between 2,000 and 4,000 UK citizens still in the country. Here, the Court of Appeal has heard the accusation that judges showed excessive deference towards the Home Office's view that promises made by the Rwandan government would protect migrants from potential ill treatment. 6 asylum seekers in the UK are challenging the High Court's dismissal of a series of legal bids against the illegal migration bill. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, says she needs the crucial power to stop European judges from intervening in the deportation of people who arrive in the UK via unauthorised routes. And lastly, the Queen Consort has paid tribute to the former Strictly Come Dancing judge, Len Goodman, who's died at the age of 78. Buckingham Palace says Camilla, who's danced with Len Goodman, was saddened to hear of his death. Dame Arlene Phillips said her heart was truly broken. Darcy Bustle called him a true gentleman. Fellow judge Craig Revel-Horwood said Len would live with him forever. And Bruno Tognoli called him the one and only ballroom legend. He was a judge on the show from 2004 to 2016. His agent said he died peacefully and would be sorely missed by all who knew him. That's all from me. I'm back in an hour. Now back to Nigel.
Well, yesterday was St George's Day, and as you were all getting ready to get your message alert from the government at 3 p.m, or I have to say I didn't get it, I disabled the phone. But as we waited for that, a new race row erupted, but this time it was caused by Diane Abbott. It was a letter that she had printed in The Observer, and basically what she was saying is that Jewish people, travellers and others may experience prejudice, but they don't suffer from outright racism. And it's led to an absolute storm of condemnation. Now, I think for Sir Keir Starmer, this must be like Christmas has come early. Another chance to prove that he really is cleaning up the Labour Party. He's got rid of Jeremy Corbyn. And now, here was Jeremy Corbyn's shadow Home Secretary giving Starmer a complete open goal. He's acted quickly. He's made it clear he thinks her comments were anti-Semitic, and she is suspended. I very much doubt myself that she'll be allowed to stand for the Labour Party at the next election. I think this is the end of Diane Abbott's career. Tell me what you think. Farage at gbnews.uk. But the last sentence of the letter is something that no media outlets have picked up on at all and don't wish to discuss or debate. You see, they find it just too awful. Because at the end, what she wrote is there were no white-seeming people manacled on slave ships. You see, in Diane Abbott's world, slavery is just something that white people did to black people, and we are to feel guilty for the rest of time about what happened. Yet the story, I believe, is far more complex, far more complicated, and yet no one ever wants to talk about it. Well, let's talk about it now, tonight on GB News, and I'm joined by author and Professor of History at Exeter University, Jeremy Black, MBE. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight on the show. Now, let's try and get some proper facts out there, shall we? Well, wouldn't that make a nice change in this slavery debate? White people, white Europeans, were subject to slavery too. Is that right?
It's absolutely correct, including actually British people. There were Moroccan slave raiders on the coast of Devon, for example, in the 1620s.
Yes, and I also, these Barbary pirates who took something like 1.25 million slaves they took, and yes, they actually landed and raided in Ireland and in Devon and other places like that, and certainly in Italy and countries like that. About 1.25 million white people were taken into slavery. The other thing, Jeremy, that I thought was remarkable, was this book, White Cargo, written a few years ago, explaining that about 300,000 British people in the 17th and 18th century were tricked into going to America and being slaves. Now, if this is true, this would change much of the narrative. What's that story?
Well, people went as indentured labour, and some of them who were convicts, of course, were actually, if you want to use the term, manacled. So the idea which Diane Abbott mentioned, that it was only black people that were manacled, no, that's not true. I think it's fair to say that coercive labour for most people in the world was the norm in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, whether you're a slave, whether you're indentured labour, whether you're convict labour, whether you're a serf. So lots of people of lots of different colours were slaves of some type or other. And you could also argue that into the modern age, people, for example, you could say the entire modern population of North Korea are slaves. There was certainly slavery in the Soviet gulags. There was slavery in the German concentration camps. So the idea that it is only slavery has only been suffered by black people is wrong. And, the other point that needs to be faced is all societies, all cultures, all civilizations all colours, are quite capable of inflicting harm on others. The real problem with Diane Abbott's approach is her idea that guilt is hereditary. Now, that's not a principle in British law, and as far as I'm aware, it's not a principle in any other legal code, certainly in any legal code in a democracy. So if you do something and you go to prison, it doesn't mean that your grandson or granddaughter is in some way, a parasite. And I do think, if I was Diane Abbott, I would confront more the problems of the world today. I mean, look, for example, you've already had on your news bulletin the situation in Sudan, but, she's an MP for a London seat. We all know, I think the same thing would be true in Exeter, where I live, though on a much smaller scale. Within 5 miles of where we live, there are slaves. There will be people that have been sexually trafficked into this country, some of them white, some of them black, for either labour or for sexual purposes. And actually, I would rather Diane Abbott and other MPs were addressing, indeed Theresa May tried to address this in the Modern Slavery Act. And again, the United Nations reckons there's more than 20 million people who are slaves in the world at this moment. Most of them countries like Mauritania, Niger, Sudan again. Possibly Diane Abbott should be devoting her attention to those people rather than sounding off about the 17th and 18th century, about which, alas, she knows very little.
Why do you think it is that in Britain and America in particular, we're being told that somehow we have to atone for what happened centuries ago, and the debate is wholly confined to black people from Africa going over to the Americas? Why are we not allowed, Jeremy, to have this debate that you and I have been having for the last few minutes?
I don't know. I think there are a number of people who hate our country. And I think, could I make this clear? This is nothing to do with people of any particular ethnicity. There are white people as well as, who dislike the history of our country. And I'm afraid to say they're just looking for mud to throw. And I don't think it's very attractive. There are problems in Britain. There are things about our history we should be embarrassed about. But that doesn't mean that we have to go around with sackcloth and ashes at the present day. No more than other countries should do for the past, which is well beyond what those of the present day are responsible for. So for all of us, we should feel contrite if we do something wrong ourselves. If my grandfather or great-grandfather did something wrong, that's not, I'm afraid, something that I feel that I have to confess to or feel sick about.
No, quite right. Jeremy Black, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this debate. Of course, if we kept on going down this route, we'd want the Vikings, the countries, Norway, Denmark, they'd have to apologise and send us reparations, as of course would the Italians, and so on and so forth. No, I think on the historical facts, Diane Abbott has proved absolutely conclusively that her history is about as good as her mathematics. But politically, what does it all mean? Now, Harry Burns joins me, former head of Labour elections at the 2017 general election. Was this like a Christmas Day present for Sir Keir Starmer? A chance to prove that the party absolutely has purged itself of anti-Semitism, and perhaps, can I put it to you, that the Labour Party had become obsessed with the Palestinian cause?
Well, I don't think anybody ever wants to hear those sorts of views spoken out loud. I mean, I left the Labour Party in 2017 because of Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism. I've since rejoined because of Luciana Berger has rejoined, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission have given it the clean bill of health. So I don't think anybody ever wants to hear those words said out loud. But obviously, it is a point for Keir Starmer to prove that the Labour Party has changed, as he said it's changed. And I think you only have to look at the facts to see that it's not the party of 2017 anymore.
And there is a pro-Palestinian obsession with these people, isn't there? I mean, Ken Livingstone has got it, Jeremy Corbyn's got it. To a certain extent, Sherry Blair had it when she said she could sympathise and understand Palestinian suicide. But what is this all about?
I don't think I would equate Sherry Blair to Ken Livingstone.
No, but her comment was very interesting. When she said, she wouldn't approve, but she understood the motives of Palestinian terrorists.
Yes, but I think that's a world away from Ken Livingstone and Ken Livingstone.
If I accept that, fine, I'll accept that for the arguments, here.
Sure.
But what is this obsession that Israel is a bad, evil country?
Well, there is a part...
Because that leaches, doesn't it, into language that seemed to be anti-Semitic.
So there is a part of the hard left of the Labour Party, but also the country and around the world, that believe the greatest threat to humanity is, the US and the capitalists, and they tend to then fall down into the sort of Jewish conspiracy line of thinking, which then leads to sort of anti-Semitic views. So yes, it certainly exists. Yeah.
Diane Abbott, after this letter was published, desperately scrabbled around to say that the wrong draft had been... I mean, it wasn't believable at all that the wrong draft had been sent. Do you think her political career is now effectively over?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for her to come back. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to see her standing as a Labour candidate. I mean, it's not to say that she hasn't done great things in her career. She was a trailblazer, being elected in 1987. However, those views just simply aren't compatible with Keir Starmer's Labour of today, which is a party that I am proud to be a member of again.
So the anti-Semitism, that's it, it's over. Have the hard left been completely purged from Labour?
Well, it's not necessarily over until the disputes panel have looked at this and ruled one way or another. However, like I said, I think it's quite difficult for her to... there's not really a road back for her. Whether, the hard left has certainly been marginalised in the Labour Party, and lots of them have chosen to leave or have been expelled. The work is never done. I think you can't be complacent with these issues. The great staff at the Labour Party head office have to carry on doing the good work of, getting rid of people whose views aren't compatible with today's Labour Party. And
has Starmer shown leadership on this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have to say, objectively, absolutely, he did show leadership on this. And Harry, the criticism of him has been that it's difficult to know what he really believes in, that he tends to chop and change his mind. They went on a big offensive with the advertising campaign, which did take the agenda. They dominated the agenda, and, I've done things like that in the past, and it can be very, very effective. And yet, the blowback was, well, when he was at the CPS, actually, he showed himself to be pretty soft on crime and the deportation of Jamaican rapists and all of these things. Do we, you're clearly happy to be back in the Labour Party, but do we really know what it stands for?
So I don't think he showed himself to be soft on crime when he was DPP. I think it's a complex job, and I think he would, he's proud of his record, and I think that's the reason why everybody thought he would be an excellent leader of the party.
But people will throw Jimmy Savile at him, and they'll throw all these things endlessly.
But that's just that's a slur. That's not based in fact or reason.
You say that, but I mean, there could have been a case against Savile, couldn't there?
But that goes back
and
to
should have been.
But that goes back to your point about generating the type of content that generates cut-through, right? So saying something outlandish or risque is the way that you get heard by people. And so this is why politicians of all stripes are starting to embrace this new way of communicating, which is why, the advertising campaign was particularly effective, because it's a local election campaign. Lots of people aren't paying attention, but they managed to gain cut-through, which shows that he has got exactly the strategy that you need to be Prime Minister.
And you think he's going to win, don't you?
It's a long way to go, but the polls suggest so.
Well, we'll see.
There's a lot of hard work.
We'll see. Harry Burns, thank you very much indeed for joining me. And, yeah, it's been a good day, a good couple of days for Keir Starmer. I don't think Diane Abbott... she was a trailblazer in years gone by. I don't think in recent times she's been much of an electoral asset to the Conservative Party. Now, the government are in court. They'll be in court for 4 days this week, and it's over the Rwanda plan. How likely are they to win? And what does it all mean after another 497 people crossed the channel on Saturday?
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank. My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
News rate.
Well, we always knew whatever the government did, there would be endless legal challenges. Some of them as a result of the ECHR, and others, of course, because the Human Rights Act, of course, is in British law. Now, the government are, of course, trying in many, many ways. In a moment, I'll come to a report on Rwanda, but for now, some of your thoughts on Diane Abbott coming in. Sean says, once you've been kicked out of the political party, your political career is over. Well, not necessarily, no, because you can be let back in. Elliot says, probably whether she can survive as a Labour MP would be a whole other question. If she, Jeremy Corbyn and other Labour exiles form their own party, they could become a major thorn in Labour's side. Well, what they could do, yes, is get a vote that might damage Labour in some of the inner cities. But I suspect the kind of seats in which they would get a good number of votes are the kind of seats in which Labour's lead is absolutely ginormous. And finally, Gav says she shouldn't be allowed in politics again, but this sort of thing is rife in the Labour Party. Well, if you believe Sir Keir Starmer, that is what he is trying to stamp out. So, Rwanda. Let's remind ourselves, the Home Secretary went to Rwanda last month, but is now facing legal challenges. Have a look, have a listen to this package on Rwanda and the court case from GB News' own Mark White.
The Home Secretary's high-profile visit to Rwanda just last month was proof, if any were needed, of just how vital the UK government views the deal with the African nation in its efforts to halt the small boats crisis. Over 2 days, Suella Braverman was shown housing developments, education and training facilities and other support services, which the Rwandan government says stand ready to host asylum seekers in the months ahead. But of course all this stands or falls on arguments British courts have still to reach a final decision on. Last December, the High Court ruled the Home Office plans to send asylum seekers to the East African country were lawful. This week, it's the turn of the Court of Appeal to listen to the concerns again from asylum seekers and human rights groups who claim the policy is cruel and inhumane. When I sat down with the Home Secretary in the Rwandan capital, Kigali, she told me she was convinced her counterparts there would offer asylum seekers the chance of a good life and would respect their human rights.
Our partners here are ready to they're ready to support the UK in our work to stop the boats and to fix our challenge of illegal migration. We've seen, working with our friends in Rwanda, the people who come here will be resettled to live a safe and secure life. That's the humane approach, and that's the compassionate approach.
It's now more than a year since former Prime Minister Boris Johnson used a visit to Kent to announce the Rwanda policy. He claimed the threat that asylum seekers would end up in Africa rather than the UK would hold the key to breaking the model of the people smugglers, who sent more than 45,000 migrants across the Channel last year. But efforts to send the first plane load of asylum seekers to Rwanda were halted by a last-minute intervention by a judge in the European Court of Human Rights. The illegal migration bill, currently working its way through Parliament, will give British judges more authority to disregard rulings made in Strasbourg. But of course all that depends on the outcome of this week's Court of Appeal decision. And even if those judges find in favour of the UK government, it's more than likely this whole issue could end up in the Supreme Court, with a final ruling still many months away. Mark White, GB News.
Well, it was a year ago, exactly a year ago, that Boris Johnson was there at Lid Airport making all these promises. The Rwanda plan was unleashed. Rishi Sunak now says he's going to stop the boats. Mark White, what your report there is suggesting is endless legal actions.
Yeah, I mean, it really epitomises everything that the government is up against in this small boat crisis. At every move where they try to come up with a solution or part solution, they're met with countless legal challenges. We've seen it, of course, over the Rwanda plan. We've seen it with plans to have more purpose-built, larger-scale accommodation centres for those who are in this country to get away from the over-reliance on hotels. At every turn, there are those, part of this huge industry, who are willing to go to the courts to try to challenge them.
You called it an industry.
It is.
Some would say it's a very cynical word.
It is an industry. I'm telling you, Nigel, having followed this story for many years, right from the point where those that want to come to the UK seek out the criminal gangs, those criminal gangs all of the way up there school these people in how best to avoid the authorities, what to do when they get to the northwest coast of France with a view to coming over to the UK, throwing away the passports and the mobile phones that you and I have witnessed out in these boats in the channels. And then it's into the hands of the refugee charities, the human rights groups and the lawyers who are there to take on their part of this industrial process, which is offering, as of course they would, being lawyers and being human rights groups, all of the help and assistance they can to these people to ensure that their bid to stay here in the UK as an asylum seeker is ultimately accepted. And we know many of them are.
And all of this, in the last couple of days, we've learned that a 17-year-old was actually 42. And we also learn that even if the government wins this and wins at the Supreme Court, which they may well, for all I know, that individual people appealing will also get legal aid. I mean, there seems to be no end to this. Also a suggestion, Mark, that the young Indians that are coming because they want to apply for asylum, get on university courses and pay half the amount, if they're here, that they would as foreign nationals. I mean, it seems whatever the government tries to do, without doing something that upsets the international community, namely just sending people back to France, we're not going to solve this, are we?
Yeah, I mean, they are tied in knots, Nigel, by the process at every turn. And, you know, you ask yourself, does it require then from the government a commitment and a backbone, if you like, to say no more? We have to take a very decisive decision, which may mean that more often we are ignoring rules coming from Strasbourg, but they're very reluctant to do that because they're rightly proud of the fact that
that we wrote the rules 75 years ago.
Yeah.
But actually on the ECHR thing, and we've pushed hard on this programme and others on this channel, and some Tory MPs, not many, agree. But actually, the government seems happy with the ECHR, as you say. They were actually using ECHR rules against Braintree district councils over Weatherfield. I mean, we're caught in a complete impasse here.
Yeah, and I think from the government's point of view, what they are anxious to show at the moment is at least momentum, that they are trying to do things, trying to come up with what they see as at least partial solutions to stopping the small boats. And that's why we're seeing, you know, the move towards these more larger scale accommodation centres, the Rwanda policy, more agreements and deals with France on that side of the channel, the better cooperation with law enforcement. They want to show that they're doing something. They want to portray Labour as not having much of a plan, except for this mantra that they keep repeating, which is we need to give more money to the National Crime Agency to have better law enforcement. But to be fair to the government, they have given more money to the National Crime Agency. It's cooperating much more than it ever did.
Hundreds of millions more to France, and nothing changes. 497 crossed on Saturday in what was a relatively small window in the weather. The channel's been rough for week after week after week. Do you agree with me, Mark, that come June, July, a big high-pressure system sits over the channel for a couple of weeks? We're going to be overwhelmed, aren't we?
The government has been incredibly lucky that the weather has been so atrocious in the channel over the last few months. So we're actually probably a bit less than we were at the same period last year. 5,500 people have still crossed the channel despite those weather conditions. You're right. The second we get to that flat calm period where we've got great conditions, very light winds in the channel, they'll be coming across and we'll be hitting 800 to 1,000 most days easily. And then exactly as you say, what we witnessed in the height of summer last year with Manston being absolutely overwhelmed. It was gridlock there. They couldn't get the emergency hotel accommodation quickly enough to funnel people out into, so they were stuck in Manston for weeks at a time.
Mark White, thank you. We're going to need a new great big barge, maybe two great big barges, or an ex-RAF camp, or about 5 hotels every single day. If this problem hasn't come to your neighbourhood, I promise you it's coming very soon. In a moment, the war in Sudan. Do you know what's really going on? And do you know what's happening? What is the plight of the British people there? Richard Kemp will join me in just a moment.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories. Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us 4, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, a couple of years ago, the fall of Kabul, we understood that the Taliban, who we'd fought for 20 years, had taken back the city and the country. It was easy to understand. But I'll have a bet that many of you watching, listening to this, have been hearing about this outbreak of war in Sudan over the last couple of days, trapped British nationals, many other nationalities there too. And I wonder whether you've got an earthly clue as to who is fighting whom. I suspect in most cases not. Don't be embarrassed about it, which is why we've got Colonel Richard Kemp on, Telegraph columnist and former British commander in Afghanistan, who knows about this subject. Now, obviously, Rich, you know, historically, Sudan, British colony, Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, all of those things. But what is actually happening, please? Who's on what side?
I think Kitchener would find it hard to recognise what's going on now, but essentially the government of Sudan, the temporary government of Sudan, is headed by General Diane, who is also the chief of staff of the armed forces, and his kind of henchman was a guy called Hemeti, and Hemeti also commanded a kind of militia force, part of the government as well, called the Rapid Support Forces. And Hemeti has turned on Diane, and he's used his significant rapid support forces to attempt to bring down Diane and to take over the government himself. And that fighting has now been going on for about a week between those two rival factions within Sudan. And it's worth noting, by the way, that supporters of both of these two generals is the Wagner Group, the Russian Wagner Group, which has been so active in Ukraine, which is probably backing a bit more the rebels than they were backing the chief of staff, the government forces. But they've got their murky hands in there as well. OK, so it's a split effectively within the military and within the government in Sudan. The last figure I saw was about 400 people killed so far. Would that sound right to you? Yeah, I think probably more than that's probably the figure we're getting, but I would guess it'll be quite a bit more than that, and probably a huge number more wounded as well. Yeah. And the remarkable thing, looking at all of this, is that other nationalities, the French, the Dutch, the Italians, the Spanish, they've managed to organise air transport. Yeah, we've got our diplomats and their families out, but those other European countries have managed to fly out many hundreds of their own nationals stuck there. To my knowledge, up until yesterday, the British government hadn't even communicated with them. How many Brits do you think are trapped there? Well, the figures vary between about 2,000 and 4,000 British, which is a fraction of the about 16,000 to 18,000 Americans that are thought to be trapped there and have been told by their president that there's no chance of them being got out. But I don't think we should be overcritical of the government here, because I've no doubt whatsoever that they're making the best efforts they can to attempt some kind of rescue operation for these citizens that are remaining. It's very, very difficult, as is, of course, difficult for other countries who have had maybe a bit more success early on, because the people are scattered across Khartoum, they're scattered across other parts of the country. Internet communications are out for most of the time. It's hard to keep tabs on where people are and who they are. So it's a hugely complicated operation. It could be attempted, but of course the government will have to make a judgment as to how dangerous it's going to be, both for the hostages and also for the troops, the large number of troops have to be involved.
Now, we have got SAS forces out there who, of course, were involved in helping to get the British diplomats and their families out. What is the continuing role of the SAS in Sudan? And don't they find themselves in a very difficult, dangerous position?
Well, it's what the SAS is for, to overcome difficulties and to face danger. And they do it very, very competently, in my experience. Yes, of course, it's a tough mission for them. What they'll be doing, of course, now is two things, I think. One is to be reconnoitring to establish how best to carry out a rescue, to try and identify where as many people are as they can, and at the same time to be poised if British citizens are taken hostage, for example, by one faction or the other, possibility to be poised to carry out a surgical operation to rescue them. But that's basically, they're the eyes and ears on the ground of the British Armed Forces that might then launch a bigger scale operation.
Richard Kemp, thank you for coming on, discussing Sudan with us. I've no doubt we'll talk again over the course of the next few days. Many thanks indeed. And of course, many of us remember the SAS raid on the Iranian embassy in London. It was quite extraordinary. Now, the What the Farage moment really came over the weekend. The King has appointed 2 new members of the Order of the Garter. It is, well, behind the Victoria Cross, I suppose, pretty much the biggest award that the King can give out. And his choices, well, one is Lord Patten. Now, of course, long-time Conservative member of Parliament, last governor of Hong Kong, and then an EU commissioner. Well, I suppose he's had a long career in public life. The other, Baroness Ashton, Cathy Ashton, long-time operative within the campaign for nuclear disarmament, who married a well-known pollster, and indeed at one point Labour donor, who, for reasons that totally baffled me at the time, finished up as a European commissioner. She had, as I said, on her first day, risen without trace. But for the King's first 2 appointments, both to be former European commissioners, when we haven't had more than a couple of dozen over the last 2 decades, seems remarkable. And all of that as we learn that following Raab's resignation, forcing out, call it what you will, that now in the Cabinet there are 21 Remainers and 8 Leavers. Yes, the establishment is back firmly, completely and totally in charge. In a moment, we have various countries meeting today to discuss turning most, it would seem, of the North Sea into a wind farm. Does that make sense?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope?
It's very much so.
And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, what a busy few days it's been. A plethora of stories, and one that seems to have had very little attention, but I think is worthy of debate, is that Grant Shapps is in Ostend today. And yes, he's there with representatives from Belgium, Germany, France, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, Ireland, and for some reason, landlocked Luxembourg. That one is a little bit beyond me, but never mind. They're there to discuss the North Sea, and their ambition is to have a 4-fold increase in wind power in the next 5 years and a 10-fold increase in electricity generation by wind turbines by 2050 from massive turbine islands that will be built out in the North Sea. Something on this scale that is being considered, the potential environmental damage that it will do, the over-reliance, as it seems to me, on intermittent energy. Does this actually make sense? And why is there so little debate? Laurie Laybourne-Langton is an environmental policy researcher and joins me live. Laurie, is it because there's just sort of total consensus in media and politics that this is the way to tackle climate change? Is that why there's so little debate about what I think in Ostend is a very significant get-together of all these governments?
Well, wind power is one of a whole mix of different ways of generating electricity that will help us become less dependent on Russian gas and the volatile fossil fuel markets that we've seen over the last couple of years. So I think there's a consensus that you need a range of technologies to help generate that electricity and ultimately mean that we're not dependent on high fossil fuel prices like we have been recently.
I get that, Laurie, but surely the point is the more reliant you become on North Sea wind energy, if you get stuck with a big anticyclone in February, you actually then, in effect, become even more reliant on gas or something else to back it up.
So one of the reasons why there are so many countries represented today is because they're trying to create a grid that works across all of Europe. This is already largely there. The UK, for example, is connected to Europe already, and we need those connections sometimes because we transfer electricity over to Europe and we make money from it. And sometimes we have to have electricity transferred over to us. It's a really useful mechanism that's got nothing to do with conspiracy theories. It's just good economic sense and good for energy security. This will help with that as well.
Well, you can say that, but I was in the European Parliament up until a couple of years ago, and believe you me, a common energy policy was a big EU goal. Now, let's talk about the environment. We're saying that wind, and we've talked about subsidy and cost before. I won't go into that today. Let's talk about the environment. We're told this is good because it's zero carbon energy. And we could argue the same for nuclear, but let's stick on this. A study in Germany has shown that around the wind farms off the German and Dutch coast, just one bird species, the northern diver, has declined around the wind farms by 95%. And even miles away from the wind farms, the stocks are 50% down. We've seen in America, wind farms that have killed, over the course of a year, over 1,000 birds of prey, including bald eagles. The fact is, these things kill a huge amount of birds, and on the seabed, the effect they have on the seabed is not positive for the marine ecosystem either. Is there any real debate on these things?
Actually, the latest science on the actual physical impacts on marine life and life at sea aren't settled yet. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that a lot of marine life can build structures, reefs and so on, around the sort of physical casing of the wind turbine as it touches down into the sea floor. The more research needs to be done to look at how the benefits that I just described also balance with the potential impacts as well, particularly for wind turbines on the scale that they're looking to build. But, we got to set this against the very well-known impact on marine life of massive oil spills that regularly happen. And, of course, the increasingly negative impact of rising temperatures in the oceans on marine life.
Well, hang on. I mean, if sea temperatures rise, all it means is that species change their range. And there's some evidence of that, actually. Mackerel stocks going further north, etc. But back to the birds, Laurie. You didn't answer that. These things kill birds in vast numbers.
They will have an impact on bird life, sure.
An impact?
In the way that other ways of generating electricity have a negative impact as well. And don't forget that things like the air pollution coming from fossil fuel power plants have a hugely negative impact on wildlife. I cannot tell you, Nigel, that there is a form of electricity generation that will just, multiply animal life all over the place and suddenly cure all the ills that faces us. We have to look at costs and balances. And at the end of the day, moving away from fossil fuels, which are polluting our environment, cause air pollution that pollutes our bodies, and then ultimately CO2 pollution that is raising temperatures and on marine life is making the seas more acidic, which is having a very bad impact on marine life. It doesn't just move where their ranges are. So these things will help.
We better tell this to the Chinese, the Indonesians and the Indians, I think. Laurie, as ever, thank you for coming on and for debating this with me. And Laurie is right to the extent that, of course, whatever you do, there is going to be a cost and there is going to be a potential benefit. I'm just not sure building these vast islands in the North Sea makes sense. Now, it's time for Barrage the Farage, where you send in your questions. Let's begin with Anthony from Shrewsbury.
Hi, I'm Anthony from Shrewsbury. Nigel, I wondered, how influential do you think Tony Blair would be in any future Labour government, and would the Labour government try to enforce digital IDs and digital currency?
My worry, Anthony, is not Blair's influence over the Labour Party, it's Blair's influence over the Conservative Party, it's Blair's influence over national debate, and indeed Blair's influence over global debate. I mean, this is the guy, as you say, loves the idea of CBDCs, loves the idea, in fact, of a global database, and I quote, for the jabs that we will all need. And Blair has become, frankly, in democratic terms, this complete and absolute monster. So I think his influence is way, way beyond just what would happen with the Labour Party in office. But hey, he must be happy, mustn't he? He's got a high-tax, big-state Conservative Party who pinged our phones yesterday. Blairism, I'm sorry to say, is alive and well, and with record levels of net migration. Let us go to Mark, who is in Bexhill. Mark.
Hi, Nigel. My name's Mark Lane from the North High Estate down in Bexhill, the recent site for asylum seekers. How do you feel about the use of the national emergency protocols issued by the government today in an attempt to stop the Braintree Council from the High Court injunction? Again, what's the implications for us down here at Bexhill?
It was bizarre that, yes, the government did use emergency powers, but not to send anyone back to France or Rwanda. They used them to beat Braintree District Council so that they could use the Wethersfield former military site as a place to put asylum seekers. And into the bargain, believe it or not, they actually cited Articles 3 and 8 of the ECHR. I mean, frankly, you just could not make this stuff up. On the one hand, you read a big, tough front page of a Sunday Telegraph, that tells you Suella is prepared to defy everybody to get the Rwanda plan off the ground. And then you see their own lawyers in the last week arguing using ECHR. I find the whole thing totally extraordinary. Now, Jacob, got to ask you, how was your St George's Day?
Oh, fantastic. A very jolly St George's Day. And that's one of the things we're discussing. Is St George the right saint who never came to England, knew nothing about England? What about the great St Alphege, who was the first tax martyr, wouldn't pay extra tax to the Danes and had ox bones thrown at him? Or Thomas Becket stood up for the rights of the church, freedom of the church against a tyrannical state. So we'll be discussing whether we shouldn't have another, more exciting saint.
That was the Catholic Church.
Well, of course. The church, unum sanctum.
I thought he would be. St George is a very interesting choice, and you're right. But I guess St George was chosen because of this image of Christian martyrdom.
Yeah, absolutely, and because in the Crusades they are wearing his colours and suddenly they win a great victory, and then with the founding of the Order of the Garter, that's really the point at which he gets consolidated as the patron saint, and Edward the Confessor, who had been very important up until then, loses out.
Order of the Garter, the King, two new appointments.
Two new appointments,
both
yes.
Former EU commissioners.
What a surprise.
The establishment's back in control, isn't it?
You might think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Very good indeed. Well, that's enough from me for this evening. Well, you know what you're going to be discussing with Jacob. Something to look forward to. Now, April showers never, ever seem to want to end. Let's have a look at the weather. Is there some good news on the way?
Hi there, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Skies clearing during the next 24 hours, leading to a widespread frost for many of us on Tuesday morning. But despite the chilly start, actually, most places will be fine on Tuesday. We've got low pressure moving away. As that pushes into the North Sea, cold wind arrives from the north. And having seen a weather front bring outbreaks of rain to southern England and Wales during the day, well, that tends to clear away during the evening, leading to clear skies and light winds as well, which means all the ingredients there with Arctic air in place for a chilly start to Tuesday. A widespread frost, temperatures between 1 or 2 degrees either side of zero, and in some sheltered parts of Scotland as low as -6 degrees. 1 or 2 icy patches to watch out for first thing, but they'll soon clear. Further wintry showers coming into the north of Scotland, so a mixture of sleet, hail and snow showers, but any accumulations really restricted to the hills and mountains. A few rain showers around Irish Sea coast, but otherwise plenty of dry and bright weather. Sunny spells for many, even if it does cloud over a little into the afternoon. And it will feel cold out there, particularly if you're exposed to the wind across northern and eastern Scotland as well as the east of England. But where we've got lighter winds elsewhere, with some sunshine, not feeling too unpleasant. Then, clear skies once again on Tuesday night will lead to a fairly widespread frost. But towards the southwest, thicker cloud, and for Cornwall and perhaps Devon later on, some outbreaks of light rain. That'll keep things frost-free, 7 or 8 Celsius towards the southwest.